The story begins in the urban setting of Seoul on yet another ordinary day, where each civilian was going about their daily routines. However, in the midst of the calm of an ordinary day, everything changes when a young man with an athletic build suddenly appears. The young man was confused. He slowly looks around and doesn't recognize the place. He had no idea where he was. Much more than that, upon looking at his reflection in a car, he couldn't even remember who he was, realizing that he was unable to recall his own name. Despite being completely lost, when he looked closely at himself, he recognized that he was wearing some kind of military uniform, questioning why, but still unable to find an answer in his mind. It didn't matter what it was, whether his name, where he was, or what he was doing. The young man simply couldn't remember anything. However, as his confused mind wandered in his disorganized thoughts, the protagonist suddenly hears a sharp noise, and it was as if something was triggered. As soon as he heard the noise, his body instinctively reacted, spinning on its axis and delivering a direct punch to whatever was behind him in a fraction of a second. The punch ended up hitting a tree behind him, and the noise he heard was nothing more than birds chirping. But even so, his attack was enough to destroy the tree entirely. The nearby civilians stared at the feat in astonishment, but far more surprised than they were was the young man himself, wondering where that kind of strength and insane reflexes had come from. He stares at his fist. But before he had time to organize his own thoughts, he is interrupted by a voice resonating inside his head. That robotic voice greets its agent, introducing itself as a tactical support artificial intelligence implanted inside his body. That fact makes our protagonist curious, but he wastes no time and already asks the artificial intelligence where and when they were, a doubt that is quickly satisfied by the integrated system, which replies confirming that they were in 2024. Nevertheless, it continues clarifying that it, in 2024 turn, was a model of military intelligence coming from 2082. That information surprises the young man, who at first disbelieves the possibility of that being true, but soon he questions the system again, considering the possibility that he too had come from the future, but his answer was denied. Apparently, the artificial intelligence's data had also been reset, and it was unable to provide that kind of information due to losing its memory just like him. As the two were conversing, a traffic signal is mysteriously damaged as a truck passed nearby. Because of that misfortune, the vehicle's driver ends up advancing too far and colliding with another car, which is forced to swerve towards people. At that moment, the nameless young man sees a strange message appearing in front of him. It was the system warning him of the danger as, from a distance, the car that swerved collides abruptly with a metal fence with enough force to hurl a metal pole directly in the protagonist's direction. The pole flies at high speed, but he is faster and dodges in time. But a civilian right behind him wasn't so lucky and was pierced by the sharp tip of the shaft. A civilian had just been seriously injured, and chaos spread through the street as several people gathered around the fallen body of the wounded man. The boy briefly found all those colorful messages that helped him dodge Strange, but his biggest concern was the unlucky civilian who had just been hurt. The injury was extremely severe, and until he could figure out a way to the hospital and take him there, the civilian would certainly die. He begins to consider his options to help, but what cuts off his reasoning is the system, suggesting surgery right there. He immediately refuses, stating that he was incapable of doing that on his own, but the system clarifies that it wasn't talking about him, but about itself. The protagonist questions the system about how that would be possible, and it continues saying that he just needed to assess the patient's condition and let it take control. It was clear that the young man still had many questions to ask that thing in his head, but due to the emergency, he ends up agreeing and approaches the wounded civilian. Crouching in front of his body, the boy analyzes the wound caused by the shaft, a little anxious about whether the system could really treat it. But with just a few seconds of analysis, it had already managed to identify the materials necessary for an improvised surgery and informs him: a needle, thread, knife, and disinfectant only. And upon hearing that, it was obvious the boy didn't believe, thinking it was too little. Amidst the victim's desperation as he agonized on the ground, a nearby civilian noticed the unnamed protagonist's certain knowledge, asking if he could administer first aid and offering help with that. And despite not knowing if he should really trust the words of an artificial intelligence that he didn't even know what it was, he relays exactly what it requested to the other civilian. That said, the request quickly spread among the nearby people, who gradually volunteered, offering all the requested materials in the hope that he was a doctor or something similar. The pressure of people's gazes on the boy's shoulders was palpable, but the reality was that he had no idea what to do with that. He asks the integrated system how to proceed, and it demands that temporary control be granted to it, so that it could at least control its host's hands. The boy hesitates, but since time was short, he grants permission, letting himself be carried away by the urgency of the situation. A message notifies the consummation of temporary control, and immediately his hands begin to move on their own. That sensation was strange, but it was undeniable that under the system's control, his hands moved incredibly fast and with truly surgical precision. The metal shaft was easily removed from the body, and with fluidity, the needle along with the thread was used to block the bleeding and close the wound, performing the surgery perfectly. Everything was going incredibly well. At that pace, that man would be saved without any problems. But a message indicating excessive blood loss appears. That shatters the protagonist's expectations, who once again, worried, he asks the artificial intelligence if it was sure of what it was doing, but it didn't answer him. The chances of the civilian's survival were decreasing more and more, and to make things worse, his hands, controlled by the system, suddenly stopped. That moment, the civilian on the verge of death agonizes, spitting even more blood, and at that point, even the protagonist knew that didn't mean anything good. In the end, the patient was safely taken to a hospital later and was treated with appropriate surgery. And hours later, right after the hospital surgery was performed, a doctor questions one of the surgeons about the condition of the injured civilian. The surgeon in charge sighs, retorting that he had survived and was fine, which leads the doctor to wonder if the injury wasn't as serious as they thought. But the surgeon quickly denies that statement, reinforcing that when he opened the man to perform the surgery, he was completely terrified, and that if it weren't for someone stopping the bleeding beforehand, he wouldn't even have made it to the ambulance. In the middle of this explanation, the doctor asks again what the problem was that left his colleague so distressed, to which he dryly replies, stating that the wound had been closed with ordinary sewing thread. That alone already leaves the doctor stunned, but it didn't stop there. The surgeon continues pointing out how frighteningly perfect the stitching of the wound was. It was as if it had been done by a machine. The doctor adjusts his glasses, saying that it was just ridiculous, but the surgeon was as serious as he had ever been. He himself couldn't believe it when he saw it. However, the conversation between the two professionals is interrupted by the arrival of a man. This man introduces himself as Park Ki-jung, the detective in charge. He asks how the patient was while approaching the doctors. The surgeon states that he was perfectly fine, and then retorts, asking if the rumors were true about the patient's initial surgery having been performed on the streets. The agent confirms, and he was just as surprised as they were. Apparently, the man who performed the procedure did it all improvisationally with a utility knife. Both doctors didn't know that detail, so logically, when they learned about it, it was impossible to hide the surprise on their faces. The detective becomes confused by that reaction, asking if that would be such a complicated procedure, and the surgeon exclaims that it was obvious that definitely wasn't the type of surgery that could be done in the middle of the street, especially so perfectly with only a utility knife at hand. Believe it or not, that was undoubtedly what all the witnesses claimed, and no matter how much the doctors questioned their disbelieving methods, it was clear that somehow, whoever that guy was, what he did was nothing less than a miracle. That was insane. They immediately asked the detective if he knew where that individual might be now, but after performing the procedure, it seemed he just left quietly before the ambulance even arrived. A terrifying silence falls over the group after that. What had just happened was certainly not normal. Since the question about his whereabouts had been raised, the protagonist now found himself in another place in Seoul, in a public restroom. At the moment, he was washing his hands, relieved. He confesses to the system in his mind that when it suddenly stopped back then, he thought it had given up, even though it was just calculating the surgical route. Taking advantage of that moment of calm, after asking the system, because he had lost his memories and discovered that apparently someone had reset his data, he asks for his name, and since the system stated that he still didn't have a defined one, he decided to name himself. Since the system was an artificial intelligence support, he shortens his name to John Ji-in reference to this. Faced with the protagonist's proposal, a sharp silence permeates the bathroom, to the point where he questions the artificial intelligence about its silence again. But the reality is that it was just processing its new name and adding it to the data. As the young man exited the public bathroom, he admits that he also had the idea of naming it Black Flame Dragon, but that idea is instantly dismissed by Jeon Ji-in, who asserts that its current name is already good enough. It was surprising to know that Jian also had autonomous thought, but the protagonist takes the opportunity to ask about the strange uniform he was wearing. It had the emblem of a called Terra Union, which led him to conclude that he was possibly a future agent belonging to this company. But despite this, he was unable to think of any reason why he had ended up in the past, something that even John himself had no data about. The young man suggests the possibility of the system using the internet to acquire data that could lead to some clues, but the system denies it. Its capability was limited precisely to avoid hacker attacks. Therefore, this was impossible. It is then explained that Jian, instead of using devices like the internet, collects data only through the body of its host, experiencing their same sensations and constantly adding them. The information releases are executed through the young man's body and voice, being able to provide assistance in combat and intervene only when temporary control is granted to it. Even so, there are things it cannot do even with temporary control, such as directly helping by pulling the trigger of a weapon or something similar. Listening attentively to all the explanation given by John, he concludes that to eventually acquire information about why they were there, he would have to experience everything with his body. And with that said, and confirmed by Jian itself afterward, the protagonist has an idea about what they could do. That would be their first mission. He crosses a good part of the city and then heads to the first cyber cafe he found along the way. His clear certainty of where he should go impresses the system, which asks him if he has recovered his memory. But no, for the protagonist, that only sounded like common sense if what they wanted was to gather information. The only problem they had to face now was simply one: money. And since they had nothing with them, they needed to find a way to get money to enter. Evaluating their options, the protagonist questions John if it would be able to use its vocal cords or something similar, which to his surprise it confirms. Without further ado, the young man then grants temporary control to the system, which takes him to a central park and prepares everything for the show. The fact that a system designed for combat had the capacity to sing amazed the protagonist, who couldn't help but question how that could possibly be useful in combat. Apparently, this type of device served as a kind of motivation to motivate allies, which was quite dubious, but he doesn't question it further and asks why the system specifically chose that place to sing. There were several other eager singers in that square singing simultaneously and calling attention, audience attention, so thinking about the idea of surpassing them in some way seemed quite impossible. The system states bluntly that all he needs to do is draw more attention than the other singers by demonstrating a greater ability. But once again, the guy doesn't see himself as so convinced. The idea that the system for drawing attention ends up making him look like a court jester worried him. He draws John's attention, asking him only not to overdo it too much with all that, but he simply ignores him and reaffirms that it was showtime. Nevertheless, the guy positioned a donation box he had managed to get right in front, and then, in preparation, sighed. He began to sing. His beautiful acoustic melody with versatile sound resonated throughout the square, immediately capturing the attention of all the people nearby. A variety of sounds and different songs were vociferated with perfection, able to enchant everyone who, in an instant, dropped what they were doing or left other bands just to admire the talent of that star. Not even the protagonist himself, who had just been devoid of hope, believed in his own performance, which captivated the entire audience immaculately. Whether it was his ability to rise and lower tones, sound time, or even vocal versatility to the point of imitating deep and feminine voices, no one was able to define that as anything less than angelic. However, as that small performance continued, little by little, some individuals in the audience began to notice that that guy only sang the songs from the middle, without the beginning. That continuity error was due to the fact that Zhang had only been able to collect those sounds as they passed by on the street, but regardless, people didn't seem to mind much and threw a shower of money at that talented singer. This continued until they seemed to have already collected enough. So, with no more reason to stay there, he took off as soon as possible with the money he had made, ignoring the audience's protests for him to sing more. Meanwhile, all this was happening. A blonde woman seemed to watch that from a distance inside the cyber cafe. She was genuinely amazed, both by the guy and by his performance. But before she could admire him a little more, a request came up needing her attention. The girl immediately moved away from the window to return to work. But that man she saw in the square simply wouldn't leave her head. She couldn't help but feel frustrated, as she just wanted to have heard him sing a little longer. With all the necessary money in hand, the agent discusses with John the possibility of finding some clues about the ground union as well as their purpose online. But he was also concerned about the possibility of them not finding anything, and without that, they really had no other direction. Jeon says that at the moment the priority was just to infiltrate the local environment discreetly to later contact the command center. A fluid way to infiltrate discreetly was what occupied the mind of the unnamed protagonist. That is, until a flyer caught his attention on the wall. Apparently, the cyber cafe was hiring, and seeing that, the solution for a way to infiltrate discreetly immediately came to his mind. The system congratulates him for thinking of that, reinforcing that in that way both the problem of food and information gathering would be solved at once. That was certainly the best option. As he enters the establishment, the guy also thinks about the possibility of sleeping there if he actually manages to get the job, but he suddenly realizes something. He had no appropriate clothes for that occasion. That was a problem, but it seemed that the system already had a solution prepared for that. His military uniform was made of special chameleon fibers, which allowed him to change its shape and appearance into virtually anything he desired. The young man was surprised by such a convenient feature coming from that suit, but he didn't complain. It was perfect, so he immediately wanted to give it a chance. A few moments passed, and his uniform was finally ready, being a headbanger outfit. The protagonist himself admitted that he put that together thinking of the singers he saw earlier in the park, but as far as the system was concerned, all it had was the pure and absolute silence. In the midst of this, a duo of two boys climbed the stairs talking to each other, and as they talked, they eventually came across the protagonist in his rather peculiar uniform. An awkward, long silence settled in the environment. This was until they just lowered their heads and walked past that weirdo, pretending he didn't exist. The agent pointed out the strangeness of the two boys to a confused John, but even the system itself ended up agreeing that that outfit was ridiculous. A few more minutes passed, and he decided to change his clothes for something more normal and truly discreet. Thus, receiving John's approval, they finally entered the cyber cafe. As soon as he stepped into the space, the protagonist directed his gaze to his surroundings, allowing the system to scan the entire room. In a fraction of a second, everything about the establishment was captured by John, from payment methods, food, places of residence, and much more. His final conclusion was that that place was appropriate. That said, the young man nodded, and then looked for the owner of the establishment, informing him that he was looking for a job as stated in the flyer. The only problem was that as requested, he had no identity, but due to the lack of employees, the owner ended up overlooking this. However, despite the young man's interest and his pretty face for selling, the owner of the cyber cafe still had many doubts about his culinary skills, an image that his figure did not convey very well. That was a place that sold food. So as usual, the boss asked the protagonist if he could even use a frying pan. This he confirmed, when John also confirmed that this did not escape his capabilities. Thus, the owner asked the young man to make him a fried rice to see if he was that good, an order that the agent complied with, and without hesitation headed to the kitchen area. John already started his analysis of the necessary ingredients, and at his host's request, he asked for the use of his hands to do the job, something he granted immediately. With temporary control given, his body again began to move on its own, and the protagonist felt that nostalgic sensation passing through his body. It was strange. When the system took over his body, he moved with such fluidity that it was as if his body remembered how to do that. Each of his movements was perfect and calculated, to the point that when he caught the boss's attention, he was astonished by the immense speed and agility with which that disguised agent performed the entire process. The boss himself, amid his shock, admitted thinking that the young man would only cook a frozen, pre-prepared rice. But no, he was making everything from scratch. And not only that man was going beyond just rice. He was cooking eggs and vegetables in the mix, turning it into a complete meal in a matter of minutes. In just a few moments, everything was ready, and the food was delivered to the boss for him to taste, still in shock for having been able to see those hands, surgical in action of so fast that they moved. That was too surreal to be real, and the middle-aged man tried to convince himself that this dish was made in a hurry and that it couldn't have been cooked properly. He took a spoon and grabbed a piece, putting it in his mouth to prove to what elevated a small suspense. Despite having tasted it himself before offering the food to his future boss, even the young man began to feel uncertain about the taste. However, when the owner of the cyber cafe tasted the food and rested the spoon on the table, he confirmed that it was absolutely delicious, being taken to heights by that immaculate composition of flavors, hopping around and for a moment even forgetting that he was in a cyber cafe. The older man congratulated his new employee for making him feel that nostalgic sensation, but in the midst of this, the same blonde girl from before arrived at the place. She arrived at a great time, as her presence allowed the boss to introduce her as Cha Eun-seo, his niece, and from now on, the protagonist's co-worker. As soon as she laid her eyes on her new co-worker, Eun-seo immediately recognized him as the same singer she had seen in the square earlier. Her ability to identify him instantly surprised him, but she continued, admiring that coincidence, wondering why someone with so much talent like him ended up in a cyber cafe, and he merely retorted that he was just good at anything. The system in the midst protested, asserting that who was good at anything was truly him, but the protagonist told it to be quiet. By accident, he ended up saying this out loud to Eun-seo, but quickly apologized. That was not for her. Regardless, that new employee easily won over the boss with his cooking skills. That talent was well valued, especially since the only employee there was incapable of cooking even instant food. The boss asked the young man if he had any preferred working hours, and embracing that opportunity, although it sounded quite presumptuous, he demanded part-time shifts with flexible hours, and besides that, he asked to stay in the storage room while working there. Those conditions requested by the young man were quite harsh, but upon thinking better, the boss recognized more than anyone that a gem like that was too valuable to let go, especially considering the competition. He agreed. The man accepted all the conditions offered by the young man, and to ensure he would stay, he even offered double payment, as long as his cooking improved sales. The words double payment echoed in his mind until two new customers entered the cyber cafe at that very moment. They complained about having to eat food from a cyber cafe that was supposedly terrible, but were interrupted by the protagonist who took that as a challenge. He said he would cook for them, and that they could only say his food was bad after tasting it. The protagonist cooked the same rice he had proposed to make earlier, while both the boss and his niece admired his skills. While cooking, the young man extended his hand and requested a plate for Eun-seo, who carelessly ran to grab one and handed it to him. As soon as he received the plate, he just poured the delicacy into the container with precision and voila, it was ready. The blonde girl was surprised by that immense speed, but she didn't even have time to be impressed, as at her uncle's command, she quickly took the plate to the clientele. And while all the food was being prepared by complete, the two clients had just sat down at their computers, commenting on the boldness of the new employee. They had no expectations and believed that this was just a desperate marketing game from the cyber cafe, but even before they could hit play on their games, the dish had already arrived. That speed scared them, but even more than that was the extremely luxurious appearance of that dish in the waitress's hands. That dish was so well presented that the customer even thought about the possibility that they had been given the wrong order. After all, they had only ordered rice, but that delicacy was their order. A fact, as confirmed by the waitress herself, who stared at the dish she had delivered as if she were going to eat it herself. The two clients were a bit reluctant, but decided to give it a chance, grabbing a spoon and taking a portion to taste. And the effect was instant. Just by tasting a small spoonful of that food, false memories were projected in their minds as part of a strange feeling of nostalgia they felt when tasting the perfection of that dish. Their eyes were tearing up, and they were unable to contain that radiant feeling just for themselves, exclaiming how good it was while asking for more. The exaggerated reaction of the two clients ended up catching the attention of the other people present in the cyber cafe who were curious and asked to try it too. A wave of orders then followed one after the other, and when it returned to her boss, she left him in shock by announcing that within minutes there had been 12 new orders. Faced with that immense wave of orders, the boss looked at the protagonist, asking him if he could handle all of that, and he redirected that question to Jung, who confirmed that yes, cooking on a large scale was the main function of that ability. After all, it was necessary to keep an entire army very well fed. That said, the young man agreed, giving him control and then rolling up his sleeves. What followed were 3 arduous and tireless hours of work, but during that period of just one afternoon, the cyber cafe sold like never before in all of history. The boss was amazed to see that river of money. The protagonist had throughout that time his mind focused on the double payment, which he asked his boss if it was still on, and he didn't hesitate to confirm. After that, The boss asked that noble young man for his name, something that he, after thinking about it for a few seconds, responded by introducing himself as Nakang In. That said, the older man congratulated him on his exemplary work and said he would prepare his place in the storage room right away. During the dialogue, Jung asked him if he had recalled his real name, given how specific he was in his selection. But he denied it, saying it was just on the tip of his tongue. Regardless of that, the system said that if that was the case, then it would be better to define Kang In as his name until his real name came up, which the young man agreed to without any problems. Then, Kang In continued working until the end of his shift, now finding himself in front of one of the computers during his break time. With his arms crossed, he was worried. They had secured a place to stay, but to receive any type of payment, an identity was needed. Thinking of a way out of that situation, he asked Jiang if he was capable of hacking, something confirmed by him having hacking techniques from the year 2082. Kang In suggested hacking a bank if that was the case, but since it was merely an auxiliary system, Zhang proves to be incapable of this. His hacking capabilities were limited solely to infiltrations, and only that. That was expected. But assuming Zhang would be infiltrating in 2024 for some secret mission, he questions whether he would at least be able to forge an identity. And now that, he says he is capable of merely requesting temporary control. Permission granted, the system begins to invade the government data center to forge the identity as requested. It was a long and tedious process, which made Kang In feel drowsy, but at the system's command, he opens his eyes, and when he does, he encounters something unusual. In Kang In, there already existed, whether name, face, or even fingerprints. Both were exactly the same in every aspect. That left the protagonist completely perplexed and confused. That shouldn't be possible after all. Everything indicated that he was from 2082 just like Zhang. That mystery piqued his curiosity, and he fervently begins to research the so-called Ground Federation on his uniform. But even so, there was no record of it in 2024. He wonders if there was a possibility that he had existed in two timelines simultaneously, but even Zhang didn't have enough data to determine that. More and more, all of this made less sense. With a fierce look, he orders Zhang to dig deeper into the personal information of this Kang In, but there was no record at all. The only information that was obtained about him was that he was unemployed. While Kang In racks his brain, he is then surprised by Yoon Seo, who appears behind him before he has a chance to hide what he was doing. Fortunately, she was naive and clueless, so even seeing all that code, she just assumed he was developing a program or something similar. With a sullen face, he asks her what the girl was doing, pointing out that it was rude to look at what others were doing on the computer, and she just laughs, pulling out a credit card and saying that her uncle had lent it to her to make purchases for the store with him. Kang In lets out a sigh of relief at the fact that the girl hadn't really paid attention to what he was doing, and ends up agreeing to go shopping with her. Outside of work, Kang In and Yoon Seo stroll through the square, with the girl praising the speed with which the young man managed to separate all the items for purchase, something he admits he only did thanks to the system, which selected the best quality ones. Not only that, but she also points out the young man's very prominent strength, saying that his arms seemed almost to be made of metal. Zhang sarcastically interjects in the middle of this to stop praising him. After all, everything Kang In has is only because of him, but Kang In cuts him off saying that wasn't true. But again, out loud. Yoon Seo misunderstands and says that it was just a metaphor, but Kang In explains that he wasn't really talking to her when he said that. Their path seemed to be coming to an end, but the blonde wanted to spend more time with the guy, suggesting that they stop at another cyber cafe to eat something, even if just for a moment. Kang In declines after all. All of this would end up going on his boss's credit card, but the girl insists, saying that he was her uncle so there wouldn't be a problem. But she is interrupted when a man bumps into her. The bump was forceful and intentional, abruptly pushing the woman against the protagonist, who catches her. The man who bumped into her strikes an intimidating pose, warning the woman to watch where she's going if she didn't want to die. Kang In and the gangsters exchange glances, and he seems to notice something. The tension emerged in the scene, and the system was able to feel the hostile intentions exhaled by those men. They were framed as a possible threat. Keeping that in mind, Zhang asks his master about the pertinence of activating combat mode. That heavy atmosphere between them, however, is suddenly broken by Yoon Seo's exasperated screams. The blonde was screaming and crying out loud, desperately apologizing to the men, and incredibly enough, the woman's sudden outburst managed to appease the tension established between them. This opened a gap for one of the men to explain himself, saying that his colleague's response was only due to his bad mood after losing all the games he played. And having said that, they simply let them go and passed by, leaving. The tension was gone, and the system ensured the state of security. With no more problems along the way, the two returned to the cyber cafe. But upon arrival, Yunseo is greeted by her uncle, shouting her name. Seeing the concern on the old man's face, the young woman approaches, asking him why he was so nervous. And with a dejected look, the boss emphasizes the chaos inside the cyber cafe, stating that the internet had been cut off without notice, causing a great problem. Hearing that, Kangin asks the system if it could have anything to do with his hacking into the government database, and if they had somehow been tracked, which the latter denies immediately. With the hacking technology of the 2000s and 20s, something like that should be impossible, so they both mutually agree that the most pertinent thing would be to check it out themselves. Kangin catches his boss's attention, asking where the server was and offering to help fix it without the need to call a specialist.